The ballroom of Vane Hall blazed with 500 candles that night. Their golden light fell across ivory columns and silk drapes, the color of crushed violets, pooling in the crystal bowls of champagne that servants carried on silver trays. One of the servants slipped, and silver tray struck the ballroom floor with a crash so sharp that the music broke in half. Knives, forks, and crystal scattered across the polished boards. And for one fatal second, Isadora Vane forgot to be crippled. Her right foot jerked back from the fallen silver before her mind could command stillness. It was only a breath, only the smallest betrayal of muscle and instinct. But across the room, Lord Evander Colworth saw it. He stopped beside a marble column, his pale eyes dropping to her slipper, then lifting slowly to her face. And he smiled. Isadora lowered her gaze to the champagne glass in her hand and forced her body back into the perfect stillness she had practiced for 9 months. Her pulse did not race. Her expression did not change. A duchess, she had learned, could survive almost anything if she did not give the room the satisfaction of seeing it. But inside, every thought sharpened to a blade. Evander had seen her foot move. If he understood what it meant, then the game she had played from this mahogany wheelchair was no longer merely dangerous. It was deadly. Because here was the truth Isadora carried in her chest, like a second heartbeat. She could walk. She could feel the cool silk of her slippers against her feet. She could feel the ache in her calf from sitting too long, and the hidden strength in her knees. Every morning, before her maid Marin arrived, she crossed the Persian rug in her dressing room on bare feet, once, twice, 10 times, until she was certain her balance remained perfect. The accident on the Hathmore Road had broken her wrist and bruised her ribs, but it had not stolen her legs. Isadora had allowed the world to believe otherwise, because the world was easier to defeat when it pitied you. Only then did the ballroom return to itself around her. Vane Hall blazed with 500 candles, their golden light falling across ivory columns, violet silk drapes, and crystal bowls of champagne carried by servants who now moved with nervous care. Lancashire's finest society had gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling, earls and baronesses, landowners and daughters in gowns of ivory, blush, and jewel tones, all turning through the candlelit air as though nothing important had happened. The string quartet recovered its rhythm. Laughter resumed. The scent of hothouse orchids, beeswax, and winter pressing at the French doors settled once more over the room. And beside a potted orange tree whose branches curled like reaching hands, the Duchess of Aldenmere sat in her wheeled chair of dark mahogany and polished brass, dressed in deep green silk chosen for beauty, not function, because Isadora had never allowed humiliation to choose her clothes for her. Across the floor, Caspian Vane, Duke of Aldenmere, moved as though the air itself made room for him. He was 36, broad across the shoulder, black-haired, with eyes the deep, cold blue of November water. In his arms, pressed close enough that propriety strained at its edges, danced Lady Seraphine Colworth. She leaned near his ear and said something that made him smile. A real smile, not the careful expression he offered the rest of the world. Isadora felt that smile the way a woman feels a door closing in a room where she had expected warmth. Her fingers tightened once around the stem of her glass. Then she breathed through it. She was very good at breathing through things now. Lord Evander reached her side 2 minutes later, sliding into the chair beside her with the ease of a man paying a social call. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head, "you look remarkable this evening. I always say adversity illuminates certain women rather beautifully. Isadora regarded him as she might regard a mildly interesting piece of furniture. Lord Evander, you are too kind. He plucked a glass of wine from a passing tray without acknowledging the servant who carried it. I was saying to Seraphine just this morning that it must be quite a weight, a woman in your condition managing the demands of so vast an estate. One finds oneself wondering whether Aldenmuir might benefit from steadier hands at the helm. Isadora smiled, gracious and empty. How thoughtful of you to concern yourself with the estate, she said softly. I shall sleep better knowing you are thinking of it. He held her gaze one beat too long, then drifted away, still smiling. 9 months earlier, on the night before the accident, Isadora had overheard a conversation she was not meant to hear. She had been returning from the East Wing, moving quietly in soft-soled slippers through the dark corridor behind the main study, when two voices came through the paneled wall. One belonged to Evander Colworth. The other was rougher, provincial, and unfamiliar. Evander spoke about a road, a wheel, and timing. Then he said, with the calm of a man discussing weather, "The Duchess is the obstacle. Without her signature, we cannot proceed, and she has made it plain she will not sign." A pause. Then we ensure the matter is resolved another way. Isadora had stood in the darkness with her candle cupped in her palm until both voices faded. She had not slept that night. The next morning, she had climbed into the carriage bound for the Hathmore dinner because she refused to perform fear for an audience that wanted her afraid. The wheel had come loose exactly as planned. She had survived exactly as she intended. Now, as the quartet shifted into a slower waltz, Seraphine Colworth pressed a folded document into Caspian's hand. The exchange was swift, practiced, hidden inside music and laughter. Caspian glanced at the document, folded it, and tucked it into the inner breast pocket of his evening coat. Seraphine gave him a small, certain smile. He answered with the faintest nod. Isadora watched every second from beside the orange tree. She recognized that document. She had seen its twin 3 weeks ago in the locked drawer of Caspian's private study. A drawer she had opened with a hairpin while Marin stood watch. It was a petition to the Court of Chancery, claiming that the Duchess of Aldenmuir, because of her infirmity, could no longer manage her affairs, and requesting that authority over the estate be transferred to the Duke permanently and immediately. The signature at the bottom was hers. She had never signed it. The marriage had been arranged in the way that most marriages of their station were arranged, through solicitors and family councils, across ledgers that listed assets the way other people might list qualities of character. Isadora's family, the Harrowfields of Darwick, had capital but no title. The Vanes of Aldenmuir had the oldest dukedom in Lancashire, and an estate that required infusions of money to maintain its grandeur. The transaction was, as Evander Colworth would later describe it in a conversation Isadora was not supposed to hear, perfectly sensible. They had married in March, in the stone church at the edge of the Aldenmuir grounds, while snowdrops pushed through the frozen churchyard earth, and the sky was the thin, pale blue of a winter almost finished. Isadora had worn her mother's pearls and a gown of ivory silk with seed pearl buttons down the back, and she had stood very straight at the altar. She had been 24 years old. She had understood exactly what kind of marriage this was, a commercial arrangement dressed in ceremony, and she had decided that morning, pinning the veil into her dark hair, that she would do her duty with dignity. She had not expected to feel anything. She had not expected Caspian Vane to be beautiful. On their wedding night, Caspian had come to her rooms as propriety demanded. He wore a dark dressing gown and carried himself with the contained manner of a man performing a duty he found neither pleasant nor entirely distasteful, only necessary. He said very little. What he said was clear and without ornamentation. He expected an air, he expected discretion, and he had no interest in the performance of affection for its own sake. He had looked at her across the candle-lit space of the room with those deep blue eyes, and something in his expression had been almost an apology, but not quite. He did not stay the night. Isadora had lain awake in the wide, unfamiliar bed, listening to the old house settle around her, the fire burning down to orange coals, and she had thought, "Very well, then." She pressed her palms flat against the linen counterpane. She breathed slowly. She decided that a man who could not offer warmth would not receive her tears. She would not weep for what she had not yet had. She would build something else instead, something of her own within these stone walls that no transaction could undo. What he did not yet know was that in reducing their marriage to its most basic function, he had unwittingly given her freedom. Seraphine Colworth had been a feature of Caspian's life long before Isadora arrived at Vane Hall. This was something the servants knew in the way that servants always know what masters prefer to hide. In the particular way the footman straightened when Lady Seraphine's carriage came up the drive. In the glance the head housekeeper exchanged with the cook when Seraphine's name appeared in the weekly dinner register. Isadora had learned it within her first 6 weeks of marriage, not from confrontation or confession, but through patient, quiet observation. Seraphine visited too often. She knew too precisely where things were kept in the private rooms. She touched Caspian's arm when she spoke to him with a casual familiarity that spoke of long acquaintance and something deeper. Caspian became a slightly different man in Seraphine's company, less closed, less careful, still not warm in the way Isadora thought warmth was possible, but less like a locked door. Isadora had watched this and had felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not quite jealousy, because jealousy requires a prior claim, and Caspian had never given her one. Something quieter and more durable, the recognition that she was already invisible in her own home. The evidence of the affair had come not in a single devastating discovery, but in the accumulation of small, careful proofs that a woman with her eyes open could not avoid. The copper ribbon she found on the floor of Caspian's private sitting room one Tuesday, silk cut from a gown or a hat, belonging to no member of the household staff. The letter she found folded inside a legal document she was asked to review. 2 lines in Seraphine's handwriting, warm and uninhibited in their affection, words that belonged to a bedroom. The evenings when Caspian departed Vane Hall under the pretense of business and returned in the small hours, moving quietly past Isadora's door without pause. She had catalogued each piece, carefully filed them in the drawer of her own desk under lock and key, and told herself that what she felt was cold clarity, not grief. It was mostly true. The truth she could not manage was that she had begun, somewhere in the first months of their marriage, to find Caspian Vane quietly, inconveniently compelling, even when he was cold, even when he was absent. She disliked this about herself. She pressed on regardless. What had saved Isadora from the slow corrosion of a loveless marriage was the estate itself, Aldenmuir was magnificent and deeply alive. 500 acres of moorland and farmland and formal garden, 17 tenant farms, a village of 300 souls who had worked these grounds for generations. Within 2 months of her arrival, Isadora had begun to learn its rhythms. She walked the farms and sat in tenant kitchens and listened. She attended estate meetings, read the ledgers, and asked questions that made the steward, a quiet man named Devlin Marsh, look at her with something close to respect. She organized the village's winter relief fund, oversaw repairs to the school roof, and visited the farm families during the difficult lambing season. These were not the activities of a duchess performing charity. They were the activities of a woman who had decided, in the absence of a marriage worth having, to build a life that meant something. The tenants began to know her name. They began to stop their carts when she walked by and tip their hats with genuine warmth. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, everything. What Isadora had not yet understood was that it would make her dangerous. Lord Evander Colworth had arrived in Caspian's orbit approximately 4 months into the marriage, presenting himself as a neighboring landowner with interests in Aldenmuir's drainage system and incidentally as his sister's devoted champion. He was clever in the way that men who have never needed to work are sometimes clever, not deep or original, but quick and skilled at reading pressure in a room and applying himself at the right angle. He and Caspian spent time together in the way men of their class spent time, hunting, at their clubs in Manchester, over dinners that lasted until the candles burned to stubs. What Evander had offered Caspian, Isadora suspected, was the particular relief of uncomplicated company, a space free of the complicated, quiet pressure of a wife who noticed everything and said nothing, and was building something of her own that no one had authorized. Evander had also, Isadora was now certain, offered something far more specific, a legal pathway out of a marriage that had never satisfied Caspian. All it required was a signature and Isadora's name. The night before the Hathmore Road accident, Isadora had been unable to sleep. She dressed quietly, took a candle, and walked the silent upper corridors of Vane Hall the way she had done since childhood, moving through darkness to manage her thoughts. She was passing the corridor behind the study when the voices reached her through the old paneling. She pressed herself to the wall, her candle shielded against her body. Her breath held. Evander's voice had been confident and unhurried. The stranger's voice was brief, practical. The words about the road and the wheel and the timing lodged themselves in Isadora's memory with perfect, terrible clarity. She stood in that dark corridor for a long time, after the voices faded and made her calculations. If she showed fear, they would know she had heard. If she changed her plans, they would know something had shifted. If she confronted Caspian, what would she say? My darling husband, I believe your closest friend is planning an accident for me. She had looked at the dark wall and known with cold certainty that he would not believe her. She went back to her room. She climbed into the carriage the next morning. She had a plan, and she would need every bit of it. Caspian Vane had met Seraphine Colworth at 27 before inheritance or title had settled on him, when he was still a second son with good prospects and a gift for law that had taken him to the Inns of Court in London for 3 quiet, bookish years. She had been 19, newly arrived from the north with her brother and her father's declining fortune, and a kind of radiant, careless confidence that Caspian, at that age, had found entirely disarming. They had been introduced at a dinner. He had walked her home through Kensington in autumn rain, laughing under a shared umbrella. For 6 months, he had believed himself entirely in love. He had made plans. He had spoken to her father. And then his elder brother had died of a fever in June, and Caspian had inherited the dukedom of Aldenmere at 28, and everything had changed. The responsibilities were enormous and immediate. His mother pressed hard and practically for a match that would consolidate the estate's finances. Seraphine's family had no money. The solicitors were clear. He had ended the attachment because he could not see another way, and he had believed, at the time, that Seraphine understood. He had been wrong about that. He had not understood the precise nature of his mistake until much later, by which point it was very difficult to undo. What Caspian had allowed to happen after his marriage was not something he examined with great clarity. He was a man more comfortable with law and ledgers than with the interior weather of his own choices. Seraphine had re-entered his life after his marriage with a casualness that had not seemed alarming because it arrived slowly and incrementally. She had come first as a neighbor, then as a friend, then as something warmer and less defined, and Caspian had not stopped it. He had told himself it changed nothing essential about his responsibilities, because his responsibilities he fulfilled. He visited Isadora's rooms when required. He provided for every material comfort. He was punctual and civil at dinner. What he did not provide was himself, his presence, his attention, his genuine curiosity about the woman he had married. And he had told himself this was acceptable because Isadora had never seemed to require it. She was contained and competent and quiet. She did not make demands. She did not weep or rage or ask for things he could not give. She had simply, quietly, gotten on with running the estate in ways that he had only begun to notice when Devlin Marsh's quarterly reports started showing a marked improvement in the Eastern farm's productivity. He had told himself this was also coincidental. He was wrong about that too. He came to Isadora's rooms on an October evening with a courtesy that had recently started to feel different from rote obligation. She was at the window when he entered, sitting in the wheelchair, her dark head turned toward the moorland, a book closed in her lap. She wore a plain wool dress the color of deep water, her dark hair loose at the nape of her neck, and in the failing light, with her profile turned away from him, she looked. He stopped that thought. He asked after her health. She answered, "Well, thank you and yours." He mentioned the winter preparations for the North Farms, and she asked 3 questions, precise and knowledgeable, that revealed she had read the latest estate report before he had. He stood in the middle of her room with his hands behind his back and felt for the first time in months a kind of uncomfortable attention to her, as though he were looking at a painting he had walked past daily and had only just noticed its actual subject. She looked up at him with gray eyes that held something he could not decode. "Is there something else, Caspian?" She rarely used his name. It landed differently than he expected. He stood for a moment longer than he should have. Then he made his excuses and left. He did not understand until much later why he had felt relieved to be gone, and even less relieved to be away. What Caspian was only beginning to register was the quality of Isadora's stillness. He had taken it, in the beginning, for passivity. The endurance of a woman in a difficult situation who had accepted her limitations. But he had watched her answer his questions about the North Farms with an accuracy that went beyond casual interest. He had listened to Devlin mention in a weekly meeting that the Duchess had suggested an alteration to the eastern drainage plan that had saved the estate £400 in repairs. He had been handed, by the Manchester Post, a letter addressed to the estate from a legal firm he didn't recognize. He had begun to notice things he should have noticed months ago. The tenants who spoke of her grace with warmth that was neither formal nor performed. The way the household operated with a quiet efficiency that had not existed before. The small, deliberate kindnesses, blankets for the schoolroom, medicines for the village physician's supply, repairs to the mill, that appeared in the estate accounts with no direction from him and total accuracy of purpose. He sat with this in his study one evening and felt something that was close to shame. Not the large, dramatic kind, the small, cold kind that is worse. It was in November that Evander had brought Caspian the petition. He presented it over dinner at the county club, between the fish course and the main, with the easy confidence of a man offering a practical solution to a complicated problem. He explained the legal framework carefully. He described Isadora's condition with a blend of sympathy and medical specificity that sounded authoritative. He made it clear that the petition would stabilize the estate's future, protect Caspian from the liability of a duchess who might make poor decisions under the influence of her infirmity. He placed the documents on the table, with a pen beside them. Caspian had looked at them for a long moment. He thought of Isadora at the window in the failing light, the precise questions about the North Farms, the £400 drainage adjustment. He thought of the words infirm and incapable and unable to manage, and something in him resisted. Not a dramatic refusal, not a clear moral position, but a quiet internal friction. A sense that the papers on the table did not correspond to the woman he had been watching with increasing attention. He had not signed them. He said he needed more time to review. And Evander's expression, just for a moment, had shifted into something that was not quite patience. It was the first time Caspian had noticed that beneath the pleasantness, something colder lived. Seraphine had come to him 2 days after the dinner. She came in the evening to his private study, leaning against the edge of his desk with her copper hair loose at one shoulder, beautiful and warm and entirely certain of her place. She told him, gently and reasonably, that the petition was necessary, that Isadora was struggling, that she herself had spent many afternoons with the poor dear and could attest that her mind was not what it had been. It would be a mercy, truly a mercy, to relieve her of the weight of legal responsibility. Caspian had listened, and then Seraphine had said something quieter, offered almost as an afterthought, that stopped the resistance in him cold. She mentioned, in passing, a transaction from 7 years before, a debt Caspian had incurred before the title, a document he had altered to conceal the debt from his father. She had not been explicit. She had not needed to be. The shape of it was clear enough. Sign the petition, or the document's existence becomes known. His jaw tightened. He looked at her, at the beautiful, certain face of a woman he had once thought he loved, and felt something that was neither warmth nor affection. He nodded. He said he would give it further thought. He did not say no. And later, alone, he sat in the dark of his study and understood for the first time what kind of trap he was already standing in. Late that same night, after Seraphine had gone and the house was dark, Caspian took out the document she had given him at the October ball and read it again under his lamp. He read Isadora's signature at the bottom. He was a man trained in law. He looked at signatures as professionals look at them, with attention to weight and rhythm and the thousand small specifics of an individual hand. He had seen Isadora sign estate documents twice in the past month. He looked at the signature on the petition and looked at the genuine ones in his memory, and he sat very still for a long moment. Then he folded the petition carefully. He placed it in the locked compartment of his private desk. He sat back in his chair and looked at the fire burning down in the grate. Something had shifted in the room. He did not fully understand yet what it was, but he felt with the cold precision of a lawyer looking at evidence that the ground beneath his feet was not what he had been told it was, and that the woman in the wheelchair down the corridor was not what anyone had been telling him either. He stayed in his study until the fire died. He did not sleep. When morning came, he went to the North Fields and walked alone for an hour in the cold, trying to decide what kind of man he intended to be. The charity exhibition for the Lancashire Children's Relief Fund had been Isadora's initiative from the start. She had spent 3 months planning it with the estate's housekeeper and the village schoolmaster. An auction of donated artwork, a music program, a tea for the donors. Scheduled for the first week of November in Vane Hall's formal dining rooms. Seraphine had arrived at Vane Hall 6 days before the exhibition and repositioned herself as its primary organizer in the course of a single afternoon. She spoke to the housekeeper with warm authority about flower arrangements. She wrote notes to 3 local donors on Vane Hall stationery. She turned to Caspian at dinner and said brightly, "I've been helping poor Isadora with the arrangements. The dear thing has so wanted to contribute, but it's all been rather too much for her." Caspian had glanced at Isadora. Isadora had smiled her gracious, empty smile and said nothing. Inside, she was counting to 10. Inside, she was also adjusting 3 specific parts of her plan. Because a woman who moves this boldly in your own home is a woman who believes the house is already hers. And a woman who believes the house is already hers will make mistakes because certainty is the enemy of caution. The exhibition went ahead without incident, which was itself informative. Seraphine stood at the doorway of the dining room in a gown of amber silk and received the arriving guests with a confidence that Isadora, positioned near the fireplace in her wheelchair, observed with clinical attention. She watched how Seraphine spoke of the Duchess as an inspiration, a dear friend, a brave woman who had wanted so much to be involved and had done what she could from her chair. The guests looked at Isadora with warm, careful sympathy, the kind of regard given to a beautiful object under glass, admired but not consulted. Several came to speak to her personally, and she received each of them with genuine warmth and asked intelligent questions about their work and their families, and more than one left the conversation with an expression that suggested they had expected less. Seraphine noticed this. Isadora saw her notice. The copper-haired woman made a small adjustment, moving back to Isadora's side more frequently, filling the air around her with light chatter that prevented meaningful exchanges. Protective management, Isadora thought. She is beginning to understand that even in the chair I am not harmless. Good. Let her feel that uncertainty. Uncertainty makes people careless. 3 days after the exhibition, Marin brought Isadora a letter intercepted from the morning mail through quick fingers and familiarity with the household's postal patterns. It was addressed to the Duke, from the Manchester firm of Holt and Greaves, not the Aldenmere Estate's traditional solicitors, but a secondary firm engaged privately by Evander Colworth. The letter contained a progress report on what it called the matter of Aldenmere Trust restructuring, referencing 3 of the specific asset transfers that Devlin had brought Isadora weeks earlier. More significantly, it referenced a date, December the 3rd, at which point the full petition documentation would be ready for submission. December the 3rd was 3 weeks away. Isadora read the letter twice. She folded it with precision. She placed it in the leather case that held her growing file of evidence. She then sat for a moment with her hands still in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and made the calculation she had been running and rerunning for weeks. She needed Caspian. Not because she required his protection. She had never required that. But because without his active testimony, certain elements of the legal case were circumstantial. And the Colworths had enough money and connection to turn circumstantial into dismissed. The forged documents were multiplying faster than she had anticipated. Devlin brought her 2 more in the second week of November. A letter purportedly from Isadora, requesting that the estate's eastern farmland lease agreements be transferred to a holding account controlled by Evander's firm, and a codicil to the household accounts authorizing a quarterly management fee to Colworth Properties Limited. Both bore her signature. Both were very good forgeries. The hand was close, genuinely close, but there were consistencies Isadora had trained herself to see. The slight heaviness in the downward strokes, the subtle difference in the angle of her capital I. Whoever was forging her signature was skilled, but not her. She photographed the documents with the compact camera that Devlin had quietly procured from Manchester in October. She sent the photographs and the originals to her Manchester solicitor through Marin and the Morning Post. She sent a second set to a handwriting expert at the University of Edinburgh, whose name she had found in a legal journal. She was building a wall, brick by careful brick. The question was whether she could build it faster than Evander was building his case. December the 3rd was still 19 days away. It felt like 19 hours. Marin came to her on a Thursday evening with the particular quiet of someone delivering news that is worse than expected. She had been present in the corridor outside the Duke's private study during an afternoon meeting. The meeting had included Caspian, Evander, and Mr. Alderton, the Aldenmere estate's head solicitor, whose professional loyalty was to the dukedom and therefore to Caspian. They had spoken for 1 hour and 12 minutes. Marin had heard through the door the words petition, competency review, and court of chancery. She had heard Evander say, smoothly, that the process would proceed quietly, and that the Duchess need not be disturbed with the details. And then, this was the part that made Marin's face still and careful, the sound of papers being moved across a desk, the sound of a pen, then silence. Isadora received this information without visible expression. She sat with it in the evening quiet of her room for a long time after Marin withdrew, the fire going down and the moorland lost in early dark. She pressed her hands flat on her lap. She breathed slowly. A pen. Had he signed? She did not know yet. What she did know was that she had run out of time for uncertainty. She picked up her pen. She had letters to write. The letter she wrote that evening was addressed to the Right Honourable Court of Chancery, London, and it was formal, precise, and complete. It identified herself as Isadora Vane, Duchess of Aldenmere, in full possession of her faculties, and formally objected, on the grounds of fraud and forgery to any petition presented in her name without her consent. It enclosed a summary of the evidence gathered, referenced the original documents in the custody of her Manchester solicitors, and requested an immediate injunction against any asset transfer pending investigation. It was, in its careful, measured way, a declaration of war. She sealed it herself. She addressed it herself. She handed it to Marin with specific instructions. It was to go with the first post in the morning, by registered delivery, accompanied by a duplicate sent separately the same day. She also wrote, on a second sheet, a shorter letter, more personal, less formal, and this one she sealed and set aside without a name on the envelope. It was for Caspian. She was not ready to send it yet, but it was ready to send. That was the difference between patience and paralysis. Knowing the difference between waiting for the right moment and simply being afraid of the wrong one. The response from the court came in 11 days, 3 days before December the 3rd. Formal and brief. The court acknowledged receipt of the Duchess's objection and confirmed that no petition had yet been formally filed. It further confirmed that, pursuant to the Duchess's objection, any petition filed in her name would be subject to mandatory identity verification before admission. In plain language, Evander could file his petition. But the court would write directly to Isadora to confirm she had signed it, and Isadora would say she had not, and the investigation would begin. Isadora read the letter twice, folded it, and filed it in her leather case. Then she allowed herself, alone in her room on a Tuesday afternoon, while the gray moorland stretched outside her window, a small and private smile. It was not a warm smile. It was the expression of a woman who has been patient for 9 months and can now see, clearly, the shape of what patience has built. She picked up the sealed letter for Caspian. She looked at it. Then she set it down again. Not yet. She needed one more thing first. She needed to look into his eyes and know whether the man sitting across from her was worth what she was about to give him. She asked Caspian to come to her rooms on a Tuesday evening. She asked Marin to deliver the request on paper, formally, because she wanted him to understand it was not a casual summons. He came at 8:30 after dinner, when the house was settling toward quiet, and the corridor outside her room was empty. He knocked once, which he had not always done, and entered to find her by the fire. Not at the window this time, but in the chair drawn close to the hearth, the firelight picking out the green-gray of her eyes and the composed stillness of her face. He looked tired. She had begun to notice in the past weeks that Caspian looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the physical. A strain around his eyes, a tension in his jaw that was not there in the summer. He sat across from her without being asked. He did not lean back. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the careful attention of a man who has decided to pay it. "You wanted to speak with me." Not a question. She looked at him for a moment. "I want to tell you something that is true," she said. "And I want you to tell me something in return. Also true. Can you do that?" A long pause. "Yes," he said. He said it simply, and she believed him. She told him about the corridor behind the study. She told him about the evening 9 months ago, the candle in her palm, the voices through the paneling. She told him exactly what she had heard, in Evander's voice and the stranger's voice, about the road and the wheel and the necessity of removing an obstacle. She told him she had climbed into the Hathmore carriage the next morning, knowing what had been planned, because she refused to perform fear for an audience that wanted her afraid. She told him about the months in the wheelchair. She told him about the notebook, the files, the Manchester solicitors, the Court of Chancery letter. She told him about the forged signatures, the transferred assets, the petition. She told him about the poisoned wine and the stable cat that had been 15 years old and entirely beloved. She did not tell it with emotion. She told it the way she had kept her files, clearly, precisely, in sequence, with evidence at every step. She watched Caspian's face as she spoke. She watched the careful, lawyerly composure begin to change, slowly and then rapidly, like ice at a water's edge, holding, then giving way all at once into something rawer and less controlled than she had ever seen in him. He was quiet for a long time. After she finished, the fire settled in the grate with a sound like a held breath releasing. Outside, the wind moved across the moorland and pressed against the glass. He sat with his hands closed together and his head bent, and Isadora waited, because she had learned very thoroughly how to wait. When he finally looked up, his face was stripped of its usual careful arrangement, a man looking directly at something difficult, without the option of looking away. "The document at the ball," he said. "From Seraphine." She nodded. "I knew it wasn't your signature," he said. "I knew it the night I read it. I was trained in law. I know what your signature looks like. A beat. I did nothing." The words landed in the room like stones. He looked at them. She could see him looking at them. He did not dress them up or defend them. He said simply, "I was being held." And then he told her about Seraphine's threat, the debt from 7 years before, the altered document, the specific thing she had said in his study that had stopped his refusal cold. He told it without self-pity, which was the first thing that made Isadora believe it was genuinely true. The debt and the alteration dated from Caspian's years at the Inns of Court, before his brother died, before everything changed. He had borrowed money from a moneylender under terms he could not afford to service, and when his brother's decline made clear that the title and all its responsibilities were coming, he had panicked and altered the record of the debt in a legal document that passed through his hands. It was a young man's desperate error, small in absolute terms, but significant in legal ones. Evander Colworth had been, in that period, peripherally connected to the moneylender's network. He had found the altered record. He had kept it. Seraphine had held it as insurance against the day she might need it, which had arrived when Caspian showed signs of refusing the petition. This was the architecture of the trap, not simply a scheme against Isadora, but a set of interlocking pressures designed to make Caspian complicit without giving him any obvious exit. Isadora listened to all of it. She let it settle. She looked at the man across from her, the cold, difficult, beautiful man she had married, and she saw for the first time what had made him this way. Not a villain, not a weak man. A man who had made a mistake in fear and had been carrying it for 9 years, and into whose wound the Colworths had, with great precision, inserted a lever. "The document you altered," Isadora said when he finished. "Where is it now?" He looked at her. "In Evander's possession, I assume." She shook her head. "It was," she said, "until 3 weeks ago." She went to the leather case beside her desk and withdrew a document she had not yet shown him, one she had been keeping for this specific moment. It was a letter from her Manchester solicitors, referencing the recovery and legal nullification of an altered debt instrument from 1887, obtained from a private archive through the cooperation of its holder as part of a broader fraud investigation. It had a value of exactly nothing now. Isadora held it out to him. Caspian took it from her hands. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her with an expression she had no name for, something between disbelief and a kind of devastated relief, and something else underneath both of those, something older and more painful. "You knew," he said quietly. "You had this." She met his gaze. "I had it for a week," she said. "I was waiting until I knew whether you were worth giving it to." The silence after that was a different kind of silence altogether. He set the document on the mantel with a care that was almost reverent. Then he turned and looked at her as though for the first time. "Tell me what you need from me," he said. "Not what can I do, not what is the plan. Tell me what you need." As though the question were personal. Isadora looked at him steadily. "I need your testimony about the petition, what Seraphine said to you, the exact conversation, under oath if necessary." He nodded. "I need you to revoke the power of attorney that Evander filed on your behalf last month." "Yes, he filed it. You didn't know. I know. Devlin found it." His jaw tightened. "And I need you to attend the county assembly on the 14th of December, which Aldenmere is hosting, and do exactly what I am about to tell you." He looked at her. "And do what?" she told him. It was a detailed, specific, completely composed plan that she delivered in 7 minutes without consulting any notes. When she finished, there was another silence, and this one had a different quality still. He was looking at her the way he had looked at the North Farm questions, the drainage adjustment, the estate reports, with the attention of a man who had been walking past something important and had finally stopped. He said, "All right," 2 words, and meant entirely. He rose to leave just after midnight. He moved to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame, his back to her, and stood there for a moment in a way that was unlike him. Uncertain, visibly uncertain, which was not an expression she had ever associated with him before. He turned halfway. In the firelight, his face was open in a way that cost him something. "When you say you were waiting to see if I was worth giving it to," he said. "What changed your mind?" Isadora looked at him for a moment. She thought about 9 months of watching him from a chair. She thought about the North Farm meeting, the drainage report, the October evening when he had said her name differently. She did not give him a simple answer. She said, "You looked at the petition and you didn't sign it. Even under pressure, you didn't sign. I noticed." He stood in the doorway with the firelight behind him, and his face absolutely still, absorbing this. He nodded once, very slightly. He said, "Thank you." He said it simply, without performance, and then he left. Isadora sat in the firelight for a long time after the door closed. She felt something move in her chest that was not a plan or a calculation. She did not examine it closely. She had work to finish first. Seraphine Colworth arrived at Vane Hall on the morning of December the 1st without a prior arrangement, which she had never done before. She swept past the housekeeper and up the main staircase as though the house were already hers, as though the natural momentum of the scheme had given her a kind of gravity that could not be questioned. She knocked once on Isadora's door and opened it before being asked. The room was bright that morning, winter sun coming strong through the tall windows and laying pale rectangles across the carpet. Isadora was at her desk, not the window. She had papers in front of her, a pen in hand, and looked up when the door opened with the unhurried expression of a woman interrupted in the middle of work she intends to return to. Seraphine stood in the doorway, with her copper hair swept back and her amber traveling coat still on, as though she had not planned to stay long. Her eyes went to the papers on the desk. Her expression held the bright, charitable smile Isadora had long since learned to read as performance, but under it today, something else, a sharpening, a thinning of the performance over something harder underneath. She was, for the first time, not bothering to fully conceal what lived beneath the warmth. This was informative. "I wanted to check on you, dear," Seraphine said, settling into the chair by the fire with her usual ease. "I've been so worried. The December cold is always difficult for you, I imagine." Isadora capped her pen. How considerate. She folded her hands in her lap, the familiar posture of the gentle invalid, but did not wheel herself to join Seraphine by the fire. She stayed at the desk. Seraphine's eyes moved to the leather case. "Are you managing the correspondence yourself today? Isn't that tiring?" "Not particularly," Isadora said. Seraphine's smile adjusted fractionally. "I was speaking with Caspian this morning," she said, her voice taking on the particular careful warmth of someone establishing territory. "He's been worried about you as well, of course. We both feel it would be such a relief for you, once the legal matters are settled, to be free of all this administrative burden." She said it as though she were describing a kindness. Isadora said. She was watching Seraphine with the same calm, patient attention she had been applying for 9 months. "Tell me, Seraphine, when you say the legal matters, which legal matters do you mean specifically?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Isadora watched something happen in Seraphine's face. The charitable smile stayed, but underneath it something recalibrated with the speed of a very agile mind. "The estate management review, of course," Seraphine said smoothly. "We're all hoping it will give you some relief." "Yes," Isadora said. "I imagine you are." She said it without any particular emphasis, in the same quiet, pleasant tone she had used all morning. Seraphine looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the leather case again. Then she looked at Isadora with eyes that had shed, for perhaps 3 seconds, all pretense of warmth. It was a look of direct appraisal, cold, rapid, and intelligent. It lasted exactly until Isadora met it. Then the warmth came back, practiced and immediate, and Seraphine rose to her feet. "I must go," she said. "But do take care of yourself." She leaned down and pressed a kiss near Isadora's cheek, as she always did. Her voice was very soft as she straightened, intended only for the two of them. "One can't be too careful," she said. "In your condition?" She left. Isadora sat in the silence of her room for 1 full minute, not moving. Then she rang for Marin and gave 3 specific instructions in a calm, clear voice. Seraphine had just made her first unguarded move. Isadora intended to use every inch of it. That afternoon, the letter arrived from Edinburgh. It was from the handwriting expert, Dr. Fenwick, methodical and precise, 4 pages of detailed analysis. And its conclusion was unambiguous. The signatures on the 6 documents submitted were not consistent with the reference signatures provided. They showed multiple markers, characteristic of deliberate imitation rather than authentic authorship. The report identified, with professional specificity, the pressure patterns, stroke angles, and letter formation discrepancies that distinguished the forgeries from the genuine. Isadora read the report in its entirety. She made a copy in her own hand, summarizing the key findings. She placed both the original and the summary in the leather case alongside the earlier evidence. She then wrote to her Manchester solicitors, enclosing the Edinburgh analysis, and directed them to present the full case file to Detective Inspector Harrow of the Lancashire Constabulary, who had been designated to the estate fraud referral she had filed in October. She sealed both letters. She put them in the Morning Post. She felt, when she set down her pen, the specific, clear-headed calm of someone who has placed the last brick in a wall that is now complete. The wall would hold, or it wouldn't. She believed it would hold. She believed this with the particular confidence of a woman who has built it herself. Caspian came to her late that afternoon, unannounced. He had been in the North Fields all morning, and he looked like a man who had spent the morning out in the weather and had not subsequently found anything indoors to settle him. He stood in the middle of her room with his coat still on and said without preamble, "Seraphine has told me the petition will be filed on the 3rd. He looked at her. She said it has your signature and Evander is presenting it personally. Isadora nodded. She is correct about the date and about Evander's plan to present it. She looked at him carefully. What she has not told you is that the court will require identity verification before admission, because I asked them to, in October." Caspian was still for a moment. He removed his coat, which he had not taken off coming in, and set it over the back of the chair. He sat down. He looked at the fire. "She also told me," he said more quietly, "that she has engaged a physician who will testify to your incapacity at the court's request." A pause. "She is more organized than I gave her credit for." "She has been planning this for over a year," Isadora said. "Possibly 2. The accident was not the beginning. It was step 3. He looked at her sharply. "Then what was step 1? She told him. His face, as she spoke, was very still and very pale. They sat with that for a moment. The fire was warm and the room was quiet, and outside the moorland held the dark of early December, under a sky thick with unshed snow. The silence between them had become, in the past 2 weeks, a different kind. Not the cold distance of strangers, but the working quiet of 2 people thinking in parallel about the same problem. Caspian said, without looking at her, "I should have seen it sooner." "Yes," Isadora said. "You should have." She said it without cruelty, as a simple fact, because he had said he wanted honesty, and she had taken him at his word. He absorbed this with the stillness of a man who has decided to receive what he deserves. "The physician Seraphine has engaged," Isadora said then. "Do you know his name?" He told her. She nodded slowly. "I know his financial records. Devlin found them. He owes Evander's firm £1,100. She opened the leather case and withdrew one more document. "He has been paid £300 in advance to provide the testimony." Caspian looked at the document. He looked at her. He said very quietly, "Good God." And then after a moment, "How long have you been building this?" She met his eyes. "Since the morning after I came home from the Hathmore Road," she said. The evening of December the 2nd, the night before Evander planned to file the petition. Isadora sat by her fire long after the house had gone to sleep and let herself be afraid, not of the petition or the court or the scheme. She had handled all of those. She let herself be afraid of the other thing, the warmer, less manageable thing that had been growing in the space between two chairs by a fire and truthful conversations in the late evening. She thought about what Caspian had looked like when he asked what had changed her mind. She thought about the slight uncertainty in his face, that small, costly exposure offered without defense. She thought about 9 months of watching a man from a distance, and all the evidence she had gathered about who he actually was under the cold, complicated exterior. The quiet improvements to the farm laborers' wages that appeared in the estate accounts without announcement. The books he had delivered to the village school without his name attached. The way he had looked at her in October across the failing light of the afternoon and said her name as though it meant something. She sat with all of this in the firelight. Then she banked the fire carefully and went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time, but she was no longer afraid of the wrong things. That was the beginning of something. December the 3rd arrived with hard frost that glazed the moorland silver and made the stone of Vane Hall gleam cold in the early light. Isadora rose at 6 o'clock, as she had every morning for 9 months, and walked the length of her dressing room carpet in bare feet before Marin arrived, feeling the cold boards and the Persian wool alternating under her soles. She dressed carefully, a gown of deep charcoal with a high collar and jet buttons, not her usual quiet colors. She arranged her dark hair herself, pinning it with her mother's silver combs. She sat in the wheelchair for the day because the day was not yet over, and until it was over, the chair was still useful. But she sat in it differently, with a quality of readiness that was probably invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 9 months learning to look at her. Outside the window, the frost held the garden in perfect stillness. The stone benches were white with it. The box hedges had gone rigid. Everything was suspended, waiting, the way that December mornings in Lancashire wait before the light decides what kind of day it is going to be. Isadora drank her tea. She opened her notebook. She began her last list. Evander filed the petition with the Court of Chancery at 10 o'clock in the morning. The confirmation came to Vane Hall by telegram at 12:30, not to Caspian, but to Isadora's Manchester solicitor, who was already in communication with the court and transmitted the news to Isadora through Marin. Filed as anticipated. Court has issued verification requirement per our October communication. Letter dispatched to your grace by registered post this morning. This was exactly what she had expected. The court would write to her, formally, requiring her to confirm the petition bore her genuine consent. She would write back, also formally, also precisely, and say that it did not. And then the investigation would begin. She folded the telegram. She placed it in the leather case, which was now full enough that the clasp strained slightly. She looked at the clock. The county assembly at Aldenmuir was in 11 days. She had 11 days to let the legal machinery do what machinery does when properly set in motion, and to make sure that when the assembly came, everything was in order. 11 days. She had already waited 9 months. 11 days was nothing. Seraphine came to Vane Hall that afternoon and went directly to Caspian's study. Marin had positioned herself in the corridor with a needlework basket and excellent hearing. Seraphine was, from Marin's account, not performing warmth. She was direct, sharper and more exposed than Isadora had ever heard from accounts of her manner. She had discovered, from Evander's contact at the court, that a verification requirement had been issued. She wanted to know what Caspian had done. She accused him of having told Isadora about the petition. He denied it, technically truthfully, since Isadora had told him, not the other way around. This distinction was insufficient for Seraphine, who shifted from accusation to the threat. She reminded him, briefly and explicitly, of the altered document from 7 years ago. Marin heard Caspian's answer, and when she reported it to Isadora, it was word for word, because some words are impossible to misremember. He had said, "Do what you like with it." And then the door had opened and Seraphine had left. Marin had stood in the corridor with her needlework basket and listened to the sound of those retreating footsteps until they disappeared down the main staircase. Then she had gone straight to Isadora's room. When Isadora received this, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said to Marin, "He said that?" Marin nodded. Isadora looked at the fire. He said it knowing she might actually use it. It was not quite a question. "That's what it sounded like, Your Grace." Isadora put her hands in her lap. She looked at them for a moment. Then she reached into the leather case and withdrew the sealed envelope she had been carrying for 2 weeks. The short personal letter with no name on the outside. She held it for a moment, then she handed it to Marin. "Take this to the Duke, tonight." Marin took it without comment, which was one of the things that made her irreplaceable. After she left, Isadora sat by the fire and thought about a man who had made a mistake at 27 in desperation and had been carrying it for 9 years. A man who had just, knowing it might cost him everything, said, "Do what you like with it." She thought about what kind of man says that. She thought about what kind of woman she had spent 9 months slowly, carefully, against her better judgment, choosing to believe he could be. She stayed by the fire until it burned low. She did not add more coal. She let it burn. Evander received the court's verification letter on December the 5th. He arrived at Vane Hall the following morning, earlier than his sister, brisker in manner, with less performance and more directness. He asked to see the Duke. He was told the Duke was at the North Fields. He asked to see the Duchess. He was shown into the small morning room where Isadora sat by the window in the December light, her leather case open on the table beside her, and her hands folded in her lap. He came in and closed the door behind him without being asked. He stood across the table from her. He was a man who had spent several years reading her as a woman, in a chair who noticed nothing, and he was finding it difficult, in this moment, to reconcile that image with a woman who looked back at him with gray eyes that were calm and entirely without pity. "You filed with the court," he said, "your objection." "I did," she said, "in October." The word October landed in the room with weight. He was quiet for a moment, then, "This won't work, Your Grace. The legal resources at my disposal are considerable," she said. "Yes, I know exactly what they are." She opened the leather case. "Sit down, Lord Evander." She showed him 6 documents. She named 3 witnesses. She summarized the Edinburgh handwriting analysis in 4 sentences. She described the bribed physician's financial relationship with his firm in 2. She explained the structure of the asset fraud, the holding company, the transfers, the timing, the amounts, clearly and without emotion. She spoke for exactly 8 minutes. When she finished, Evander sat across from her with the expression of a man who has been holding a hand he believed was unbeatable and has just watched the table turn over. He understood what she had. He understood what it meant. He said, after a long moment, "What do you want?" and she told him. It was not a simple demand. It was a specific, legally enforceable set of requirements. The immediate reversal of all asset transfers, the withdrawal of the petition, a sworn statement admitting the forgery, and the surrender of all forged documentation to her Manchester solicitors by December the 12th. In exchange for this cooperation, she said, she would not press for criminal prosecution to the fullest extent, which would include the bribery of a court physician, which carried a specific and unpleasant sentence under current law. She watched him understand all of it. She waited. Outside, the frost still held the garden. Nothing moved. Evander left Vane Hall at 11 o'clock without seeing the Duke. He had not agreed explicitly to anything. She had not expected him to. Not immediately. Men like Evander required the appearance of a decision freely made. But she had watched his face across 8 minutes, and she knew what she had seen. She had seen capitulation. On the 9th of December, a message came to her Manchester solicitors from Holt and Greaves, indicating a willingness to discuss resolution of the outstanding matters. The solicitors responded within the hour. Formal negotiations began. Isadora sat in her room on the afternoon of the 9th and let Marin pour her a cup of tea, and did not touch the leather case for the first time in weeks. The wall had held, more than held. Now there was the county assembly on the 14th, which would serve a different purpose, not legal, but social, and in some ways more permanent than any court ruling, because courts could be appealed. But what happened in front of one's entire community had a different kind of finality. She wrapped her hands around the teacup. She allowed herself to be warm for a moment. She looked out at the moorland, brown and vast and entirely unmoved by the dramas of human beings. She thought, 11 more days. Then she began planning them. The County Assembly of Aldenmere was held on the 14th of December in the Great Hall of Vane Hall, opened and warmed and arranged over 3 days with the efficiency that Isadora had come to expect from Mrs. Pratt and the household staff, who had been given a purpose and delivered it with pride. 240 attendees came, lord lieutenants and magistrates and landowners, village elders and mill owners, church representatives and the editors of 2 county newspapers, along with the principal tenants of the Aldenmere estate itself, who had been specifically invited at Isadora's request. They arrived in their good clothes, with the slight dignified uncertainty of people unaccustomed to inclusion in rooms of this kind. The hall was lit with more candles than it had held in years, 5 iron chandeliers and banks of tapers along the walls, and the December cold pressed at the tall windows, while the room inside was warm with fire and bodies, and the low anticipatory murmur of people who had been told an important announcement was coming, and were not yet sure what kind. Seraphine Callworth arrived at 2:30 with her brother on her arm, both dressed with the careful precision of people who expected to be looked at when things changed. They were not wrong. Isadora had arrived early. She was positioned at the front of the hall to the right of the raised platform, in her mahogany wheelchair, because today, specifically, she needed to be in the chair. She wore ivory silk, which she had not worn since her wedding morning. Her dark hair was pinned with the silver combs. She sat straight, her hands in her lap, and greeted the arriving guests with the specific personal warmth she had built across 18 months of tenancy visits and village initiatives, addressing people by name, asking after children and harvests and health. Seraphine swept past her with a smile that was all performance and a glance that held, underneath the amber fabric and the copper hair, the last residue of calculation. Evander did not look at her at all. His face had the gray, closed quality of a man who has made a deal he cannot entirely accept, but has no alternative to. He had signed the cooperation agreement 3 days earlier. His solicitors had submitted the reversals to the court. He was here because appearing was still less damaging than not appearing. Isadora watched him find a seat near the back. "You are the last person in this room," she thought. "Who knows how completely finished you are?" Caspian took the platform at 3 o'clock. The room settled immediately. He had that kind of presence, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. He stood at the lectern in his formal coat and looked across the assembled hall with the composed expression of a man who has decided exactly what he is about to do and has made his peace with it. He began with estate business, the winter preparations, the tenancy reviews, the infrastructure plans for the coming spring, and the room listened with the attentive patience of people who understand that assemblies have forms that must be observed before the real matter is reached. Isadora watched from her position to his right. She watched the room. She watched Seraphine, who was watching Caspian with the confident proprietorial attention of a woman waiting for a performance she has choreographed. She watched Evander, who was looking at the floor. She watched Devlin Marsh standing near the side door with his quiet moorland face and his hands still at his sides. She watched a young farmer from the eastern tenancy, who had come in his Sunday coat, sitting in the second row with his wife, who held their infant daughter in the crook of her arm. These were the people this was actually about. She kept them in her sight. "I have an additional matter to bring to this assembly," Caspian said when the estate business was complete. He paused. The room shifted. That particular collective reorientation of an audience, sensing the tone, has changed. Seraphine straightened slightly in her chair. Her brother went very still. Caspian looked out across the hall and said, clearly and without ornamentation, "It has come to my attention, and subsequently to the attention of the Lancashire Constabulary and the Court of Chancery, that a deliberate and systematic fraud has been perpetrated against the Aldenmuir estate. This fraud involved the forgery of the Duchess of Aldenmuir's signature on 6 separate legal documents, the unauthorized transfer of estate assets valued in excess of £15,000, the filing of a fraudulent petition in the Duchess's name, and the attempted procurement of false medical testimony." A sound moved through the room, a murmur, a collective intake, a shifting of weight. 2 women near the front exchanged a glance. The young farmer's wife looked up from her infant daughter. Seraphine's face was very still. "The legal evidence for these offenses has been in the custody of the court since December the 9th, Caspian continued, along with a full cooperation statement from the principal party. He paused. "Lord Evander Colworth." He said it clearly, which was the thing that made the room truly understand that the pleasant, familiar Lord Evander, who attended their dinners and sat on their committees and spoke of estate welfare with such polished concern, had been systematically robbing this community for 2 years. He did not name Seraphine, because the cooperation agreement had specified the principal party, and Seraphine's involvement was, legally, more complex. But he looked once in her direction, with the quiet, clear look of a man who has shed a particular blindness and will not put it back on. He then said something no one expected. He said that in consideration of the fraud and its legal resolution, he had this week executed new estate trust documents, countersigned by the court, granting the Duchess of Aldenmere full and irrevocable co-authority over all estate affairs, financial and administrative. He said that in his view, this was not a generous act, but a corrective one, as the Duchess had been managing the estate's welfare with better judgment than anyone else in the room, including himself, for the past 18 months. He said he was sorry it had taken him this long to say so publicly. The room was very quiet. Then the young farmer began to clap slowly, and the sound moved from the second row outward like a wave. Then Isadora stood. She had planned this moment precisely, not for theater, though it was theater as well, but because the room needed to understand fully what had been hidden and what had been protected. She placed her hands on the arms of the mahogany chair and rose, steadily, unhurriedly, with the straight-backed composure of a woman who has been standing up in the only way that mattered for 9 months. The applause stopped instantly. The silence was absolute. 240 people looked at her, some with shock, some with dawning understanding. Several of the tenant farmers with expressions of profound, quiet satisfaction. The expression of people who have always known something and are watching the room finally catch up. She stood at her full height in the ivory silk, the silver combs catching the candlelight, and she looked out at the hall calmly. She said, clearly and without drama, "I am the Duchess of Aldenmere. I have never been unable to walk. I owe you all a greater explanation than this room can hold today. But I want you to know that every decision I have made from this chair has been in service of this estate and its people, as it will continue to be." And then, from near the side door, Devlin Marsh gave a small nod to the 2 constables who had been waiting there since 2 o'clock. Evander did not resist. He was a man who had accepted 3 days earlier what was coming, and he met this moment with a composure that was perhaps the closest he had come to genuine dignity. He rose from his chair. He walked between the constables through the silent hall, his eyes forward, his chin level. He did not look at his sister, which told its own story. Seraphine remained in her chair for a long moment after her brother was gone, very still, her copper hair bright against the candlelight, her amber gown perfectly composed. Then she rose slowly and walked toward the exit without looking at anyone. The crowd parted before her without drama, because the room understood what it was watching and did not need to make it into more than it was. Isadora watched her go. She felt, looking at Seraphine's straight back and her precise exit, not triumph, not exactly, but something cleaner. The specific clarifying relief of a thing that has been hidden being allowed to be over. She was still standing. The hall around her was beginning to breathe again. The young farmer's wife was holding her infant daughter up as though offering her a view. The baby blinked at the candlelight with the serene, interested attention of someone encountering the world for the first time. Isadora watched the baby for a moment. She felt something warm and certain settle in her chest. The house emptied slowly, the way houses do after large events. Gradually, then all at once, until only the servants remained, quietly restoring the great hall to its ordinary arrangement, carrying away chairs and snuffing the extra tapers. Isadora stood at the tall window of the hall's anteroom and watched the last carriages move down the Aldenmere Drive in the December dark. their lamps bobbing through the frost-silvered trees, her feet in their silk slippers were slightly cold on the stone floor, and she was aware of this with a specific private pleasure. The pleasure of a sensation she had been pretending not to feel for 9 months. She heard Caspian step behind her before she heard the door. He came to stand beside her at the window, not quite touching. They watched the last lamp disappear around the bend in the drive together. The moorland beyond the parkland was dark and vast under a sky that had begun, at last, to release its snow. Thin flakes, very fine, falling through the window light and disappearing against the grass. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence was warm. "Evander will cooperate fully," Caspian said. "The solicitors are confident the court will proceed quickly." Isadora nodded. "And the asset transfers?" "All in the process of reversal. The eastern farmland leases will be restored by February. The £12,000 is more complicated. Evander has to liquidate against personal assets, but the solicitors estimate full recovery within the year." She let out a quiet breath. "And Seraphine?" The name settled between them with weight. Caspian looked at the window. "She left Lancashire this morning. Her family has a house in Edinburgh. I imagine she'll remain there for some time." He paused. "There is no direct legal case against her specifically. Implication without direct evidence." "I know," Isadora said. "I chose that deliberately." He looked at her. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because destroying her completely served nothing. The estate is safe, you're clear, the tenants are protected." A pause. "And I am not in the business of cruelty for its own sake." Caspian looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then, quietly, "No." And the word held something in it that was not simply agreement. It was the sound of a man recognizing someone. They moved from the anteroom to the drawing room, where the fire was banked high and a tray of tea had been set by Mrs. Pratt, with the particular dignified foresight of a housekeeper who knows what a household needs before it knows itself. Isadora sat on the settee near the fire. On the settee, not in the wheelchair, which had been left in the hall. And Caspian took the chair across from her, and for a while they simply occupied the same warm room, without the pressure of strategy or urgency for the first time she could remember. The snow had thickened outside. Through the tall windows, the garden was disappearing into white. The stone benches and box hedges slowly gentled into softness. Maren had left the tea tray and withdrawn with the tact of a young woman who understood that some moments in a house belong only to the people in them. Isadora poured. She handed Caspian his cup and he took it, and for a moment their fingers were close without quite touching. He looked at her across the rim of the cup with those deep blue eyes that were, right now, neither cold nor complicated. "I need to tell you something," Caspian said. "That is not about Evander or the court or the petition." He set down the cup. He looked at the fire in the way she had begun to recognize. Not evasion, but the gathering of words that don't come easily to a man who has spent his adult life behind legal language and social armor. "I told you on our wedding night, on the worst night I have ever spent as an adult, though I did not understand that at the time, that I had no interest in a wife beyond necessity." He looked at her. "That was a lie." He said it simply, without decoration. "Not a conscious one. I had convinced myself it was true because the alternative, allowing myself to want something that could be taken away, was not something I knew how to manage. After Eleanor, after the debt, after inheriting everything and being responsible for all of it. He stopped. I was afraid, he said, which is a very small word for a very large thing. He looked at her steadily, with those eyes that had held so much and shown so little. I have been afraid of you specifically, Isadora, for approximately 9 months. I began watching you, he said, somewhere around the 4th month. I told myself I was observing the estate's management. I told myself I was ensuring that the Duchess's activities were appropriate. I told myself many things. He smiled, briefly, wryly, directed at himself. Devlin's reports, the drainage adjustment, the school roof, the farm visits. I found excuses to read your correspondence through proper estate channels, not improperly. And every time I read something in your handwriting, I noticed something new. The exactness of your thinking, the kindness underneath the precision, the way you never asked the tenants for gratitude, only gave them information and let them make their own conclusions. He looked at her hands on the teacup. I noticed the day you ordered the blankets for the schoolroom without telling anyone. I noticed the letter you wrote to old Mr. Calloway when his son died. I didn't mean to read it. It came across my desk by error, and I read it twice. He paused. And somewhere in all of that noticing, something happened that I did not plan and cannot undo. And I'm not sure, he said quietly, that I want to undo it, which is the most frightened I have ever been in my life. He looked up at her. Outside, the snow fell through the garden in silence. Isadora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 9 months in a wheelchair, watching this man from a careful distance, watching him choose not to sign the petition even under pressure, watching him sit in her room with honest words and painful admissions, watching him stand in the county hall and say publicly what he could have said quietly in a solicitor's office without any of the social cost. She thought about the letter she had written him 3 weeks ago, the short, personal one that had gone to him through Marin. He had not mentioned it until now. She had not mentioned it either. It had simply existed between them as something true and acknowledged, and not yet spoken aloud. She set down her teacup. She looked at the fire for a moment, the way he had, gathering something that didn't come easily. I wrote you a letter, she said. I know, he said. I have read it many times. She looked at him. Then you know what I said. Yes. A pause. I want to hear you say it, he said, with a directness that was new and cost him something. She met his eyes. She said, I love you. I have loved you for months, against every piece of evidence I tried to use to prevent it. He exhaled, a long, slow breath, as though he had been holding it for a very long time. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the settee, close enough that she could see the firelight in his eyes and the careful way he was looking at her, as though she were something genuinely precious and he was only beginning to understand that. He took her hand. He held it in both of his, with a steadiness that was nothing like the perfunctory visits of the early marriage. Nothing clinical, nothing transactional. He held it the way someone holds a thing they have finally decided to stop pretending they don't value. Outside, the snow had covered the garden entirely. The stone benches gone, the box hedges rounded white, the stone of Vane Hall holding the cold at arm's length, while the inside of it was warm and firelit and very quiet. The old house breathed around them with the settled ancient patience of buildings that have held many lives and can hold more. Isadora leaned her head slightly toward his shoulder. The first time she had chosen to lean toward anything since the wheelchair had seemed necessary. His hand tightened fractionally on hers. "I want to begin again," he said quietly. "As ourselves. Not Duke and Duchess, not a transaction." She looked at the fire, at their joined hands, at the snow beyond the window. "We have been ourselves," she said, "for longer than you noticed." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, small, honest, warming, brief as the first daylight through a cleared sky. Then he was quiet. She was quiet. The snow fell. The fire burned on. And Vane Hall held them both, as it had always been willing to, if only they had been willing to stay.